I would be curious, maybe I start with a question first. So one, you're traveling quite a lot, right? So is there, from your perspective, any difference in the awareness of DDD around the world concerning different, I don't know, cultures? Is there a difference? So you need to unmute as well, one.
Yes. Okay. Can you turn off the echo?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So yes, definitely, there's a much greater awareness of domain-driven design than there was before my Red Book was published, and so we are making people more aware of domain-driven design. But I think the new problem is that people are viewing domain-driven design as a silver bullet, and not only a silver bullet, but a silver bullet that travels at the speed of a bullet, and that somehow, some days of training and a few days of consulting is just going to transform them from many big balls of mud to, a new microservices architecture. And it's just impossible. And I think that the expectations are too high. And it's probably because people are trying to use DDD, let's say, in too many places, while we can still use domain events in supporting subdomains. It doesn't mean that we should try to give a lot of attention to those supporting subdomains. Just make the events flow and give more attention to the core. And that's a discipline that some teams are learning, and I'm happy to report that they've done well with that. But many organizations, I'm talking about like Fortune, 100 companies, Fortune 200 global, Fortune global, they expect far too much out of DDD too soon, when they don't even really understand what DDD is meant for, and they don't get Conway's law, so, or modularization. So that's why I say you've got to get these three things right, before you can be successful in anything else. So that's sort of my experience.
So maybe a question for Eberhard before we kick off with the what's happening in the chat. So from your perspective, when we look into next 10 years and then look back, what do you think, what would DDD be like in software space, or maybe in the next 5 years? How do you think will it evolve from importance, impact? Will it decrease, or is it really tough to tell? Or which route would you recommend to go, maybe?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, I would argue that it's only important. The focus should always be on what helps you in your project, and I wouldn't really mind too much about the latest hype and what the latest hype might be. I do believe that there are some shifts in terms of how DDD is perceived. So first of all, obviously nowadays bounded contexts are much more important. The more coarse-grained way of doing things, while in the past we have rather been talking about tactical design a lot. And nowadays I would argue, I mean, obviously the whole DDD thing started with Eric's book. It's now a whole community, and there are a lot of things that are coming to the surface, and that are new. So I would argue that there is this whole new thing around collaborative modeling, and that got started with event storming. And even though, and that is again something very different from what we've seen before. I mean, it's not about, this is how we would design systems in the sense of these are the parts of the system that you would come up with, but it's rather an approach to have some kind of meeting or some kind of activity to come up with the model. So it's on a different level. And I would assume that this is what we are going to see more of in the next few years. And it's, as I said, it's something different. I mean, technical design, strategic design basically says, okay, these are the parts that you want to combine somehow. And these collaborative things basically say, okay, this is how you do the meeting to come up with something. So that's very different.
So to the audience, if you have a question, maybe just come down here. You can ask, right? So otherwise, I would now go on with one more question for Vaughn Vernon. So you talked about the most 3 important things for you when getting started with DDD. Now, I would turn it around. What's the 3 most fallacies when you would start with DDD? What shouldn't you do? So worst things.
Yeah, wow, very good question. The first thing that enters my mind is just focusing too much on the tactical patterns, the tactical tools. This is also something that teams programmers are attracted to these tools because it teaches them some discipline in areas where they've failed before. Although I would say that a lot more emphasis should be given to DDD modules, which are simply, .NET namespaces and Java packages, or whatever language you're working in. There must be some sort of modularization capability there. But even with modularization, if you don't follow the language drivers, then your modules are going to be nonsense. And I see a lot of technical kinds of modules like, com company dot, context dot model dot entities, dot services dot. And this is just a mechanical way of modularizing. So I would say maybe that's 1 or 1.5 of the biggest problems. Trying to use domain-driven design without having conversations with the business, without domain experts. And I think you have to find a balance there because, first of all, you have to be willing to seek out the business. And what I find actually is that developers want to argue with me saying, well, you can do DDD without having a domain expert. We don't talk to the business. And it's like they're trying to say, well, you're wrong about this. We can, and all that I have to say with that is, good luck, right? Or something like that. And so engage with the business, but then developers, when they engage with the business, they're constantly trying to correct the business. They're not making it fun. They're talking technically. Instead of the developers going over to the business side of things, the developers want to always drag the business into their world. And that just isn't going to work well. If we were really, smart people as developers, we are going to be able to have conversations with the business. And again, it's spaghetti business, not, it's really hard stuff. And we have to be willing to engage with the business. And even in my workshops, when I act as a domain expert and I go around to teams and I try to engage with them as the domain expert, they regularly tell me they don't need to talk with me. They already got this. No, I got this. Yeah, Eberhard knows, right? So, and it's funny because, and then they're the ones saying, "Oh, the business isn't available. We don't know who the domain expert is. Oh, it's all the business's fault. We can't do that." No, it's actually developers' fault. It really is, clearly. So I don't know. Is that 3 things? Maybe that's 2 3/4. But that's pretty much what I see the main failures in.
Yeah.
Maybe Eberhard has a different experience.
No, actually, I wanted to add to that, because what I do in trainings is I basically say, okay, I'm the domain expert and I'm also a consultant. So if you have any questions concerning domain-driven design, or if you have any questions concerning the domain, just step up and come to me. And, I'm going to answer all your questions. So I'm like the ideal customer who knows, or domain expert who knows everything. And it's very telling, and it's something that I learned there, that first of all, hardly ever anyone steps up to me, and second of all, I'm sitting in the presentation of the results, and I'm like, I never said that, and they are like, oh, you definitely did, and I'm like, no, not at all. And I think as a developer or software architect, that is really something that I took away from that. I mean, it's actually precisely what Vaughn just said, that it's so very interesting to sort of be on the other side and to see how that works out. And I mean, I do that sort of on purpose, because I think the people who are doing the exercise, they should see how they are going to do it, and I'm going to help them, but it's not my task to, step up to them and tell them you're all wrong about this and that. I mean, they are in the lead. So I think that's quite interesting.
And I'll just say, in addition to that, that is exactly what the business will end up doing. They will just end up disengaging, and they will say, see, it's the same thing as the last 20 years or 30 years. So nothing has changed.
No. Okay, I mean, if I have to add to that, I mean, the reason why I started computer science is because I'm interested in, computers and engineering, and I'm not interested in domains, because then I would be doing something different. So I think that's sort of one of the explanations, and I sort of understand why we end up in this situation, because I'm not a salesperson or whatever I'm trying to build. I'm not the person interested in e-commerce. I'm interested in software. So, but I mean, at one point you have to realize that in order to do software successfully, you have to talk to customers. And that is basically, I think, sort of the essence of domain-driven design. I mean, that's even what the name says, right? It's all about the domain, and you somehow have to deal with that, right? It's one of those problems. So if you studied computer science and you think it's all about computers, well, there you go. It's not.
I love this conversation. I hope you don't mind, but do you find that because developers are developers, that they mostly are good or want to be best at algorithms, like in the small, and DDD calls for software development in the large?
Yeah, I think that's what it is, and I have to admit that in particular concerning algorithms and these kinds of things, I mean, that's you mostly see that in job interviews, right? I mean, you hardly ever see that in your job. I mean, if I think theoretical computer science and algorithms and all these kinds of things, I thought they were quite interesting when I had them at university, but I have a hard time remembering that I ever used that knowledge. So, and that is something that is actually wrong about the industry as a whole, in my opinion, that people who are interested in humans and interactions and domains, even if they start studying computer science, they will probably be scared away by this very technical education that we give them. You're still on mute.
Yeah. One thing that I want to note is that I don't even know when this happened, but maybe it's been 15 years or more. But I don't really care so much about all the intricacies of these small things in software development. And what I am very happy to do is get things into working order and then let someone else who is really into that fine-grained minutia of detail to take over from me and just make it better, right? I just want to make it work in terms of, I want the business part of it to be known, and then somebody else can come back after me and go like, oh, Vaughn, you're right, really, you do really horrible at this. Okay, fine. But we got the business right. So
yeah, which is also, by the way, something that I find very interesting to know about your own sort of limits and where someone else should take over, and to accept that everyone is an expert in a specific field. I mean, you can't be an expert on the very fine details. You can't be an expert on the domain and on domain-driven design. You have to focus on something and then realize that other people can do other things better. I mean, and that's again something that I think that is basically what software engineering to me is. It's a collaborative game where people join together to sort of win the game. So that's I think the metaphor. Shall we take a few questions from the chat or the audience?
Yeah, I think so. So I will try to go with the first one. So the first one was already gone. Wait. So Niklas Lochschmidt is asking for the channel discussion. Services sharing a database are generally frowned upon, but aren't shared messages buses very similar? Both need to be well managed and need a lot of adapters to work. Example given, what is the difference between a schema registry for a published language and the schema of a multi-user database with use for consumers? Yeah, there's some note by another person, but in general, he wants to know about sharing databases in comparison with shared messages, I think.
Well, I'm not, yeah. Yeah, so the, I'm just waiting for you to mute because okay. So first of all, I don't think the schema registry represents a shared, database kind of thing. I guess I see the point, but you're not sharing a database. And the other thing is, a domain event is not necessarily meant to be consumed on the inside of an interested bounded context. Generally speaking, you will translate a domain event at the boundary of that context into the language that you speak internally. So from that standpoint, it only says this happened. What you do about that happening should not leak far into your bounded context. So for that matter, maybe, I don't know. I have a hard time actually seeing those two things as similar, but maybe that's just my viewpoint. I would go ahead. Sorry. Oh, I thought you were going to say something, Eberhard. Sharing actually at that point is just saying, I understand that this can happen. What we do about that happening is different. Now, the command, if you're sending a command from a downstream context to an upstream context, well, you have to know that that command exists, and you have to know what correctly to put in it. But you can also isolate that at a boundary. So your bounded context has this outer ring, let's say, of the ports and adapters architecture, where you have an adapter that's going to talk the various languages that it needs to talk. But it doesn't mean that internally you have to be coupled to that. It could be, in fact, that your own internal domain event that happens in your context will lead you to make a command request to another bounded context. That could be through messaging. It could be through REST, or, and there are trade-offs to all of those things, but, ways of communicating between contexts. I want to address the other thing too about shared message bus. Yep, that can be problematic, but if you go back to the original, Fred George says, I am the inventor of microservices. Okay, okay. And Fred George says, use a shared message bus, basically put everything on one Kafka topic, because, and let the various microservices determine what they want to consume. Because if you have thousands of microservices, it's going to be impossible for everyone to listen to every topic or message bus that all the other ones are consuming. Now, creating separate message buses or separate topics for a smaller number of bounded contexts, which I would say is, at least the first good step in creating microservices through the bounded context. So if you have 5, 7, 10 bounded contexts in your solution, it can be less difficult to have 5, 7, 10 different topics, but it's still not the easiest thing to do. So there's a trade-off there, and I think a large part of it is simply security. Do you want all contexts to be able to see all messages of all other contexts, or not? Otherwise, I think the throughput of Kafka or any sort of message bus, as in a true message bus, I think it's a matter of security, because probably for most organizations and systems, Kafka has plenty of throughput, or any message bus has plenty of throughput to handle a single topic. So that's my take.
Yeah, so I really like your answer, and I really want to give an probably entirely different perspective on it. So first of all, what the answer sort of says is, well, if you have a shared database and if you have shared message buses, you have a lot of adapters to work. I'm not sure whether that actually says that there's a lot of technology involved. I would argue that's probably the case. However, if you have any kind of communication, you need to have some technology to communicate. So I think that's fine. The other thing is, there is this idea, this architecture idea that basically says, okay, here is basically microservice. Here is a messaging system, Kafka, for example, because it can store events for quite a long time. Now we do event sourcing, and we take the events on the in the messaging system, and we can reconstruct the state of the microservice by consuming those events again. First of all, I would argue that's probably not, that's a weird way of doing things. But that leads to that question, I would argue, because essentially what you've created then is a system where you say, okay, here's my message bus, here are the events, they are persistent, and yeah, my microservice does have its own database and its own database schema, but it's really just a cache of the events that are in the message bus. And then you have a system where I would argue you essentially have a shared data structure on the message bus, which is much like a shared database in the end. That is also with persistence, because you can store the events for quite a long time, and that is something that I would be sort of aware of, because then you really have a very similar architecture. So you have a global database that everyone uses, and on the other hand, you have a global messaging system with all the events in there that has the data and the state in the microservices are just a cache. And I would argue that the way to, or what is wrong about that is, I guess as Vaughn mentioned, that the internal models should be very different. Maybe you're not interested in all the events. And also, if you do event sourcing, I would rather use it, do it with my own private model inside the microservice or the bounded context to make sure that I have my own model, and that to me is actually what bounded contexts are about. So that is how I would interpret that question. If you have Kafka and if you have persistent events in there, and if you can reconstruct your state from that, essentially you have a global database, and it's very much alike.
Yeah, I just want to make clear, I was not suggesting doing that. I would never use Kafka as an event store, and I could go into various strong reasons for not doing that, one big one. But the point is, yes, you would have your own internal journal or, events. And it doesn't even mean that the events that you store internally should be the exact events that you publish to the outside world. Yeah. So, and I think that's, you said that in a slightly different way, but I think we're agreeing on that. So, do not use, and the retention of Kafka on a message bus kind of thing should probably not be that long. It should, I mean, who knows, right? There are advantages to having forever retention on a Kafka topic, but it could be good to also limit that. And if another service sometime needs a history of everything that happened of something somewhere, you can always create a temporary topic to feed that, just sort of in time seeding of the new service. So it depends, right? If you're using a single Kafka topic for the entire, system, and this could be 10 or tens of services, I mean, at that point, then you have to start asking, what if the versions of events changed? What if we wanted to actually force everyone to see the evolution of our events in the future when that happens? So a forever retention sort of puts everybody into this conformist mode where they have to support not only the current shape of and meaning of events, but also the previous ones. So,
yeah, I agree.
So the next question is quite consecutive. So if you were to use domain events only for the purpose of event sourcing, in example, as a persistent mechanism and not for the communication between several bounded contexts, which framework would you use? Kind of implies Axon, some stuff or whatever, but in Java, the person is interested in a specific language. I don't know if that's relevant. Maybe.
Did you think that I would not say vlingo? Is that say vlingo? Is that like?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Yannick, here's the question.
Okay. Use the framework or the tool set that matches best your situation. Vlingo is a reactive tool set, right? And some people have a difficult time dealing with asynchrony. I've been using asynchrony for a long, long time and message-driven for a long, long time. So I've written some blog posts and articles about likening message-driven to GUIs. And if you look at like the Windows GUI or the Windows API from way back, or X Windows API from way back, or Mac from way back, whatever, and we were still using like the direct sort of OS APIs for the GUI, they were all just like the messaging mechanisms that we use today for actors. So look at Erlang, look at Akka, look at vlingo, look at, there's a lot of similarity to that. And so if you understand GUI programming and the asynchrony involved in GUI programming, I mean, actors are just the same thing. And you're only dealing with one message at a time. It's really pretty simple. So I say use what's best for you and your situation. If you can't, deal with a lot of reactive going on at that actually the small object level, then maybe something like Axon is better for your situation. But I would encourage you to take a look at reactive. Reactive at the small level, right, at the object level. It's really quite useful.
So what frameworks would you recommend, Eberhard? Are there any for event sorting or any opinion?
So I don't really have anything to add. So I think Vaughn answered the question excellently. So I'm fine.
For easy one, how many bounded contexts do real-world DDD systems have?
When I was young and I would ask a question like that of my father, he would answer with, "How long is a piece of string?"
That's a weird one.
Well, in U.S. English, it simply means it's as many as it needs to be. I mean, a piece of string could be, this long, or it could be, hundreds of meters long. So.
I see. Yeah. So I mean, my answer to that would be it's sort of an elaborate answer, but probably boils down to the same thing. So I would argue that really what we are doing is we are trying to build a hierarchy of modules, and I would argue the total number of modules is not really the question. It's rather on every level. So I would argue if you have the highest level, there is the enterprise IT landscape of a company. Then the next level would be the teams working on that. Then it would be the artifacts the teams work on, and so on and so on. So it's a whole hierarchy. And I would argue that you can probably give a number for the number of elements in each of these hierarchies. So I have a hard time imagining that you have, let's say, more than 10 or 15 teams working on a system. And I have a hard time imagining that you have a team working on maybe the same number of, I don't know, microservices or so. And then what this adds up to is that there is a certain limit of in each hierarchy level, but there is hardly a limit on the total number of items that you have. So that's sort of my answer to, so how many microservices would you have in a system? It's a slightly different question. And the answer would be that depends on the number of teams, the number of people in the teams, and so on and so on. And it's really about how many do you have on each hierarchy level, because you can manage each of these levels, and that is what modularization is about. So you step up one level, and then all of a sudden you don't care about the internals of the module. It's just that you now care about how those modules interact, and that is how we build large systems. And for that reason, I mean, it also doesn't make a lot of sense to say, okay, so how many lines of code can you have in a system? Well, it depends. It depends on how you do the modularization and these kinds of things. And that is because it's at the very bottom. That is where you have this number, and you can only really, I think, reason about each of those levels and how many things you have on there. And that's basically just hierarchical composition, the key to building complex systems.
Yeah.
I would also like to give an answer. Maybe
go ahead. Go ahead.
for a second. So, because I get this question probably at every event storming workshop that I run, because the people start to take care about this DDD thing, and then they see, okay, there's now coming out bounded context somehow of the event storming sessions, and then they ask, when is it enough? So how modular do I need to go? And my answer always is similar to the one that Eberhard gave. So the point is, what do you want to achieve? You want to achieve high cohesion and low coupling in a certain way, and you also want to achieve team independence so that you can work independently and get faster cycle times and stuff, and have autonomous teams in the background. And therefore, it's not necessary to shrink everything down to, I don't know, in the end, 1,000 bounded contexts or 1,000 microservices, because this does not help for everyone to have a good overview or picture in his own mind. But the goal is to make the teams work independently. And then it depends on the team sizes. And my approach would be always to have like bigger bounded contexts and bigger like structures. You can maybe model them in the beginning smaller, but if you start implementing, go with an evolutionary approach, make it not too small. Just start maybe with bigger ones when you're unsure. If you think these 1, 2, 3 things, maybe they belong together, maybe not, then I would argue to first start with one service, for example, or one bounded context or one vertical for this thing. And then in the process, if you realize that it's too big and maybe some parts change more often than other ones, then split it up and then follow that path and have smaller services. So this could be one way to go in that regard. So this is something that I would pursue, for example. Okay, maybe opinionated, but that's my way of thinking of it. Okay, yeah, sure, go ahead.
If I could, very briefly. So again, my caution with what you just said, Benjamin, is it doesn't take into account the communication, right? It doesn't say, who do we have to talk to get the answers? And what part of the systems do we need answers about? And so DDD says, I mean, from my, what I've perceived about them is where you have specific kinds of conversations is where you divide things. It also depends too on, let's say, for example, we have a legacy system, a big ball of mud. Are we going to try to break up the whole big ball of mud, or are we only going to try to extract what is now core from within that? Maybe 2 models that, which would be 2 languages now in 2 contexts, but there are still 12 other, languages in there that are all muddied up, but we decide we're not going to touch those. Well, then we still have this big ball of mud, but we have 2 less tangled models in there, and now we have 2 explicit models, but that's better than trying to completely replace the big ball of mud. If we try to replace the whole big ball of mud, well, it's a different story. Probably start looking at what are the business capabilities of that big ball of mud. That's a place to start, but it doesn't necessarily determine where to end. It can, you can start having conversations. Well, we have a context around this business capability, but it could be that business has changed since that capability occurred, and that capability could be now 3 different conversations or 2 different conversations. So, you have to start, but then you have to iterate and discover where are these conversations coming from. And I've even seen situations where there's actually a single domain expert or just 2 domain experts for potentially like a dozen different domains. So then you have to just say, okay, we really do have to look not just at the conversations, we're talking to the same people, but what are the business capabilities that we're talking about? And is this getting too weird in this one capability? Maybe it's actually multiple capabilities now. So that's why I say it's like, it depends very strongly in this case, and my answer of, to me makes sense. How long is a piece of string? Well, it's as long as it needs to be, right, for whatever it's doing.
Yeah. I sort of, I obviously agree, and just the one thing that I want to add, if you read the original book by Eric, he gives some kind of example for bounded context, and what he basically says in that example is, I forgot the domain he was talking about. What he basically says is, so we built that domain model, and it somehow fed wrong all the time, and then we split it up, and it was just a lot better, which in my opinion basically says it's not that clear cut, because obviously they started with having those two things that ended up being into separate bounded contexts in one, and it's also it underlines the point that it's iterative. And what I try to tell people when I do a DDD training is I try to make sure that they understand that there are some things that are clear-cut. Obviously, two things like delivery and shipping, probably those are like delivery and payment, those are probably really two different bounded contexts. But then you can have a discussion about whether you still want to split it apart, and it's going to be a tough discussion, and it might be different depending on a lot of different factors and reasons. So I really want to make them make sure that they understand that this is not like this is how you do it. It's rather, again, a trade-off, and you have to figure it out. And I think it's really beautifully explained in Eric's original book.
So I just want to add to my questions, but maybe we already answered them because Gerd asked them. So how do you cope with the growth if the software becomes larger over time? In particular, is it possible to reflect the bounded context? And how should this be performed? So I think we already agreed that, of course, it's possible to refactor, and we should do it. And we should align to the business always. And I think Eberhard, you already mentioned a lot of ways how to deal with it in your session that you gave, kind of. So you already added some stuff, Vaughn. So do you want to add something more that was not mentioned yet, or do you think it's fine?
The only other thing that I would add is more often than not, business politics, company politics plays into this, and it could be even things like there's some sort of power play to own a certain aspect of the IT solutions, and sometimes management, even very senior executive management will see, hey, I'm not going to win this one. I'll try to win these other ones, but I'm going to give this up. And the whole way that the solution is assigned and allocated and paid for and everything all changes. And you might be partway done, you might be all the way done. It may have just been conceptual, and you're starting to try to discover things, and the landscape completely changes. So it's just be aware of those things too. They'll play in.
So I would also add that currently these days, so software is always better and it's never finished. And therefore it's always some change going on. And if you take DDD into account, it's also in that space. And especially in that case, because that's how we align to the customer needs. And the customer needs are changing all the time. So it totally aligns to what I said in the first talk about our age. So it's highly dynamic in the field that we are working on currently. And if you fall back in fulfilling the customer needs, you can get eaten up by the competitors. So therefore, we need to adapt all the time. So I would go on with the next question. So Manuel asks, where should configurations of services be stored inside their bounded contexts or somewhere else, centralized for all bounded contexts? Popular question.
So in my opinion, so the way that I think about these kinds of things, I try to think about a domain architecture, and that is where I think about the domain and how to split it apart into bounded context, and that's pretty much it. And then there are technical things. So in this example, I would argue that configuration is a technical thing, and that's independent. I mean, even if we have a bounded context, it doesn't even say how that would be implemented. I mean, I could have that bounded context as some structure in a deployment monolith. I could have it as a microservice, whatever. And that means that, in my opinion, there is a whole other concept of architecture, and that is that technical stuff. And the question where you should store the configuration of the service, to me, depends on operations. So if there is an operations department that somehow needs to deal with the configuration of all of the services, then maybe you want to do that centralized. You definitely want to somehow standardize it, so that there is just one technology, one way to do configuration, because the operations department otherwise would need to deal with a lot of different types of configurations. However, if you have a team that does the development and the operations, you probably don't really care. I mean, they are the ones who would change the configuration. And then basically, I wouldn't care, because it's up to them to decide how they want to run it. I mean, if there is no one else touching the configuration, why would I tell them how they want to do that? So that's my take on it. So I would argue it's the question, how would you store the configuration of a service, to me is something that is technical, and it's not related to DDD at all, in my opinion.
Okay, there are two more questions left. We don't have a lot of time left, so I would be happy if we have just one person answering. So I would read out the question and you decide who wants to answer it, right? So how do you deal with multiple customers who use different terms for the same thing? So maybe Eberhard, that's one for you, because you have many customers. I don't know. And then the next one is more like DDD basics, or maybe DDD like advanced. I don't know. Just a guess.
I shall answer this one. So there are two answers to that. First of all, it depends. I mean, that is, to me, what bounded contexts are about, in a way. So if I have a domain expert that is concerned with, I don't know, delivery, and there is another domain expert that is concerned with payments, and they talk about, an item or a customer, and you figure out that it's really something different that they are talking about, or maybe you're looking at two different bounded contexts, and then you could have that domain object in each bounded context, and it would be defined differently. The other thing, and that I would like to add, is I think the problem that we have is, in natural language, there are synonyms and all these kinds of things. So it might be natural to say, to have several different terms for something. So maybe I call it a customer, maybe I call that person a client, and it's really a synonym. Now, in that case, if those are really synonyms, so it's the same thing, or there is a problem. And in my opinion, the problem is that if I sit in front of the computer and I want to put that thing into software, I have to give it a name, and it has to be unanimous. It has to be clearly defined. It has to be one name. So I either choose client or customer. And that is something you need to do. And in my opinion, this is where there is a collaboration. So there is the domain expert who says, yeah, with the customer, with the client, the customer, the client, and so on. And it's easy for him or her, because obviously there are synonyms, and you can do that in natural language. And then you need to put it in a model, and then you can't do that anymore. So you have to have that one thing. And then it's actually the software developer or whoever builds the model that who made the decision to make this part of the ubiquitous language to use that term and not the other one. So then it becomes either customer or client, and it's, well, that's the part of the ubiquitous language then, and the other one has been sort of degraded. And that is also what I think why it's not about following the domain expert and do what he or she tells you. It's a collaborative effort because they obviously don't know how to model. They know the domain. We know how to model, and you have to put both things together to come up with a ubiquitous language where the clear terms are clearly defined, and so on and so on.
I'll just say a couple words, just a couple. When I hit that situation, I usually just say, please choose one. What do you think is best for here? Just choose one. And I actually asked that of the domain expert. So I could see that the developer could just make a decision, and that could be okay, but what if you have a conversation later and the domain expert says, what do you mean by that? Then that's a problem. So I usually just say, choose one. If you think it's, maybe one of the 3 or 4 fits better. So anyway, that's all I would say.
Yeah, actually, I agree. So I guess what I should have said is, so the developer or the modeler has to make sure that there is just one, and somehow together you have to build up that model, and you can't live with those synonyms anymore. You can only have one in the model. So I totally agree.
Final question. Yeah, Monska tries to add one more, but I'm not sure. Maybe you can answer in the chat, Eberhard, while one is tackling the last one. So how can one best deal with a situation where the domain expert's perspective on the domain is severely impacted by an existing legacy application, and where their understanding of business processes tend to be dictated by workflows implemented in that legacy application years ago? So maybe Seeker has a specific problem with legacy software. So what's your recommendation, Vaughn? Did you get the question?
Mm-hmm. I mean, really, it becomes a question of, well, here's how I'd like to refer to it. Look at Management 3.0 by Jürgen Appelo. And in there, Jürgen talks about the celebration grid, right? And he says, you can do things the wrong way, you can do things the right way. The question is, did you learn anything at any time? And so in the grid, there are the farce ends of, well, I'm not facing the correct way, but on the left-hand side, there's failure from doing things the wrong way. On the far right, it's success by using best practices, okay? In the middle, there's experimentation. And it's only through experimentation that you're going to actually learn something. So if the effort that we're making is digital transformation, then we need to actually transform. And 20-year-old, 30-year-old, even 10-year-old legacy does not necessarily reflect the current business. And so why go to the effort to rewrite? Is it because we don't like C# anymore and we want to move to, Kotlin or, whatever it happens to be? Why are we making this effort if there's nothing new to learn, and if we're not really transforming? Just leave it the same. And then let the business say, no, of course we want to, and that's where it comes out. But, the real motivations, and I mean, that's what it sort of comes down to. Why spend the money and the effort and take all the risk of trying to redo things that could likely fail? And the only motivation is just what? To modernize the language that we're implementing in? So.
Yeah, there is a slight there is a minor thing that I want to add. I mean, one of the things that I see is sometimes people say, okay, why are we doing this? Why are we moving away from legacy? And then the answer is, well, we want to do that because we want to save some costs in terms of operations. And I'm like, okay, so you want to save those costs from operations, and you do this high risk development of a new system. Why would you do that? Does that really add up? And if something like this, where basically in a way what this says is, I don't really care about the domain. I'm a domain expert, but I don't really care about the domain. Just leave it as it is. I just want to have it the way that it is in the legacy application, and just implement it in that way. And that is a project that I would rather not do. Now, what Vaughn said is he gave a very good way, I think, to deal with this situation and figure out whether you're really in that situation or whether you can gain any business value out of that. So I think that's very, very helpful. But it might be that you're just in a situation where you shouldn't be doing the project in a way. So.
And one other thing that I'll add, which I think is quite important, is if you are dealing with an IBM mainframe running COBOL, that's a really good reason just to replace it, right? Because the people who developed that software have great-grandchildren now, right? So yeah, that's a big cost too, because actually IBM mainframe licensing says you can only run the software that we tell you, IBM tells you can run on that machine. And if you try to do anything to optimize your current investment on an IBM mainframe, IBM can simply say, no, you signed this paper 40 years ago that said you won't do that, right? So literally.
Nice shout out to the finance industry. What I would like to do, just maybe stay in the call, you both, for a second. I will invite all the guests now to join you below the Beamer screen. And then Irina will take a picture of all of us. So everybody who wants to be the final picture of this nice remote meetup, one-day single screen conference, please join us now. And you can also add your Twitter in this later if you want to, and then we will link everybody. So, and Irina will give the instructions so that you know when you have to smile on the remote side as well, if you want to. So, Eberhard, I hope that's fine for you, new experience.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay. No, let's use the phone. It's easier. So I will mute, or maybe not. Do you also come? No, yeah, it's not. Hide this one. It's important. And I will try. 1 second. Okay. Everybody ready? And what we can do? One picture.
I will take one more.
Yeah, and now we do this thing. Arms front, everybody. And then you should burst. 1, 2, 3. Hey! Yeah, we did a Ola wave below you. So you will see it on YouTube. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
I think I'm really satisfied. We also got a lot of good results. So if you have some final words, please go ahead.
Well, I just say thank you to CodeCentric for putting this together and even sticking with it through difficult circumstances. And I had a lot of fun today. So thanks for listening to me too.
Yeah. Yeah, same here. And thanks for actually working on that, making it possible to do it remote and not just canceling it. So thanks a lot.
Okay. So also from my side, of course, thank you very much to the speakers. Without you, it would not have been possible with the experts, of course. So usually I hand over wine, but maybe we can find another way how we can deal with it in the future, like virtual wine or something. I don't know. I already like to grab some thumbs up. You have seen it in the chat box. So I think the audience that is remote gave some feedback already. So you heard some applause here going on, and I also had a lot of good feedback, also like incorporating the remote sessions after some hassle into their local conference and also into the local stuff going on, like having a food truck outside and cake and whatever is necessary. So I hope you enjoyed your kind of maybe first one, I don't know, or one of the first ones in that space, and we will see how it will go on in the next months. Hopefully we can meet again soon, because I like the physical interaction stuff and the coffee talk thingy one-on-ones a lot.
Sure.
Most of us do. So the hallway track is not possible like the usual way. Okay. So anything to add without? If not, then I think we can finish the session for now.
Okay. Ciao.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank
Wiedersehen.
Good evening.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.